It is entirely possible that it was during a warm summer afternoon amid a sweaty basketball game between the famed urban planner Le Corbusier, his cousin Pierre Jeanneret, and their friend Gabriel Gevrekian that the radical idea of Siam was conceived. According to Gevrekian, these games were always a bit awkward because Le Corbusier insisted on wearing his little wired basket over his good eye. Apparently, he was blind in the other eye. At age 25, Gevrekian won the first prize for his garden and water and light at the 1925 exhibition for decorative arts in Paris, following by the design of 2 cubist gardens in southern France. In 1928, he organized Siam's first Congress, a very important Congress for modern architecture. Some 20 architects, famous architects, participated, and it happened in the Chateau de la Sarraz in Switzerland. In 3 days, these architects drafted Siam's manifesto that aimed to place architecture into a socioeconomic context. This discourse on architecture enabled the split between design and politics. So architecture was now free from patronage, particularly royal patronage. This call for the profession to divorce from the state endowed political power to individual modern architects. And we have seen examples of how modernist architects have cooperated with either dictators or states like the Vichy to implement mega projects. And of course, this was very typical of the Soviet Union. In 1930, together with Mallet Stevens and Auguste Perret, Gevrekian also launched L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, a very important journal that is published today. He then joined 32 architects to partake in Vienna's Workbond exhibition under Joseph Hoffmann. Opened in June 1932, it received 100,000 visitors and was praised as the greatest architectural exhibition in Europe. Frank had been Gevrekian's teacher when in 1915, at the age of 15, he had arrived from Tehran and had begun his architectural education at Vienna's Academy of Applied Arts. By then, he was home in 5 languages and 4 cities. Having been born to Christian Armenian parents from Constantinople, raised in Tehran, educated in Vienna, and trained in Paris. After graduation, he entered the atelier of Joseph Hoffmann, leaving for Paris in 1922 to partner and open his firm in Paris. 10 years later, Gevrekian had reached such a status in the modern movement in architecture that his minimalist dwelling, as you can see here in this picture, was featured at the exhibition centers along with very other famous architects. In October 1933, the Nazi Party shut down the Bauhaus in Germany, while the Siam Fourth Congress in Moscow, planned for the same year, was canceled, and the Austrian Workbond dissolved the following year. So basically, the modern movement in architecture and in Europe actually was being suppressed by the Nazi regime. The leaders of the modern movement were on the run. So this was the moment where Gevrekian accepted the Iranian government's invitation as Tehran's chief architect. Sometimes during 1933, he arrived in Tehran amid the biggest construction boom since Shah Abbas the Great, so since the 1500s. Reza Shah Pahlavi had demolished 2/3 of the existing Qajar urban fabric, opening a clean slate, what we call a tabula rasa, upon which all sorts of architects were building the king's vision of a new Iran. If the tides had turned against the left-leaning modern movement all over Europe, in Iran, the state had embarked on the enormous task of creating the modern middle class and urbanizing Iran's city. Iran, a country as big as France, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy combined, and as rich as its deep oil reservoirs. Ruled by a heavy-handed monarch bent on top-down modernization, the Tehran of the 1930s was really a modern architect's dream come true. So, the clean slate, and on top of it, you realize a utopian vision. So in the context of urban Tehran, where there is this incline that reflects a social hierarchy, it is interesting to ask why, given the staunchly nationalist environment of Reza Shah, we see the pioneers of the modern movement, of the avant-garde movement in Iran actually come from Tehran's religious minorities. I propose here that Tehran's pragmatic push for rapid modernization created a cosmopolitan environment wherein professional architects from societal margins, Armenians, Christians, Jews, Baha'is, Zoroastrian architects, were trained to actually be sent to Europe and then to come back and bring the modern architecture, modern urban planning to Tehran. So they were the one who rose to the challenge of building the secular nation. Qajar ambivalence, so the traditional kings' ambivalence towards modernization, constantly modernizing and then changing their minds, both fueled political instability and laid the institutions and the structure which Pahlavi modernization expanded. So minority and missionary primary schools from the 1880s on, the archaeological negotiations with Europeans from the 1900s. The 1934 establishment of Tehran University was very important for education for both sexes. The construction boom of the interwar period, the Pahlavi state's aspiration for a bourgeois culture in general, and the endless demand for professional architects by state bureaucracy and major industries created the condition conducive to the expansion of modernism in Iran. And this was all centered in Tehran. So the environment that already existed was what we call a historical environment, a 19th century environment, or sort of a late medieval environment, in which you had individual architects, the memars, the memar bashis, who were trained not in the professional sense, but they were trained in terms of guilds, where one father passes down the knowledge to the son. And in the 10s and 20s, we see these kinds of architects, and you can see some examples here of these memar bashis who are building a revivalistic architecture. So here you're seeing Dar al-Funun, although it was the first secular institution of higher learning, it was still the architecture reflected Safavid, Qajar Islamic taste. Here in this Green Palace that Reza Shah commissioned, there is an eclectic approach to the design where we're seeing a little bit of Italian Renaissance, a little of Baroque. The Parsis, well-to-do Parsis, were instrumental in patronage of educational institutions. So in this case, the Firuz Bahram School is entirely eclectic in its design, even though the Parsis are coming from British India. We also have some Tiflis-born Russian architect Nikolai Markov, who is working with some of these memar bashis to build these neo-classical architecture. So the state, Reza Shah's state government was very important. So the pragmatic Pahlavi political elite, who were themselves Western educated, and you can see them here. This photograph is very interesting because they are being photographed with a camera. That is signifier of modernism. Between 1925 and 33, they brought to Iran and supported several Western architects who in turn helped create an environment, a built environment in Tehran that was primarily neoclassical in nature. So, and these are some of them. So while André Godard, the French architect, Ernest Herzfeld, the German archaeologist, Arthur Pope, the American Orientalist, and Maxime Siraud, another French architect, these were working independently in Tehran and building things, with the exception of Pope. They weren't completely separate from the state. They still had to abide by certain diplomatic rules in the context of Reza Shah's very heavy-handed politics. One of the few Western-trained Iranian architects practicing alongside them was this guy, Karim Taherzadeh Behzad, who had returned from the outdated Berlin Academy of Architecture in 1926 to join the nation-building project. His eclectic, revivalistic edifices were aligned with his European and Meimar contemporaries. As you can see, he's doing very much revivalist architecture. So between 1925 and 33, there was a diverse kind of buildings that were being erected by numerous different architects and Meimars with very different styles. We have Persian Revival, we have Safavid Revival, we have Qajar eclecticism, we have even Art Deco and Art Nouveau in the 1920s and 30s. But what was missing really in Tehran at this time, at this very crucial time of urban construction boom, was the modern movement, and particularly the international style. So when in 1933 Gebrekyan arrived in Tehran, fleeing from Nazi Europe, this was the environment in which he found himself as the chief architect of Tehran. So he brought with him not only the architectural principles of international style, so this is his Vienna, but also this idea of architecture and the modern architect and modern design being separate and sovereign from the state, not having to listen to any king or any nobility in order to design freely. So the reformist ministers quickly enlisted him into the efforts, where he took charge of the projects of Tehran municipality. So the mastermind of the Iranian 1928 civil code, the secular code, Justice Minister Ali Akbar Davar was a staunch advocate of rapid economic growth. In 1935, he appointed Gebrekyan as the head of the technical department of his finance ministry to make sure that every building that the ministries build would have that kind of modernist look, away from any Qajar or Safavid connotations. So we lose all the curvilinear forms, all the arches, all the Islamic tiles, and everything is sanitized. And the city all of a sudden becomes very regular, with very large boulevards and very modernist buildings. So within 4 short but decisive years, Gebrekyan erected 24 structures on international principles. As of his arrival, he completed a model of a new state theater. The following year, he proposed a multi-partite structure for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Lifted on concrete pilotis, the way that Le Corbusier and the Bauhaus and Siam had proposed, the Ministry of Industry rose to 7 stories of horizontal openings, as you can see in these sketches of him. And the design of the Justice Ministry in 1937, we start to see an uneasy relationship between his own beliefs about independent modernist designs, and it seems like there is a state imposition, especially Reza Shah's favorite revivalistic style. But Gebrekyan willed the greatest freedom during the design of the upper middle class villas, as he had done in both France and Austria. These were spaces of experimentation commissioned by private clients who insisted on the image of their own modernity. So these were private projects where he could do everything that he wanted. Just like as the Justice Ministry, Gebrekyan's Officers Club was probably not what he really designed. It was someone had tampered with these, and therefore this was a compromise. So the architect's sovereignty and its dependence on the state. So Gebrekyan leaves Tehran in 1937 very suddenly, and his departure coincides with the suspicious suicide of Delbar. And he returns to Europe, entrusting his unfinished projects to Vartan Hovhannisyan. So Gebrekyan and Hovhannisyan first met in Paris in 1922, although both of them were from Iran, were considered the most prolific architect of Reza Shah's period. Hovhannisyan spent 16 years in Paris, first at the L'École des Beaux-Arts and then at the École Spéciale d'Architecture. In 1923, he worked for Sauvager before opening his own firm in Paris. So the second modernist to return to Iran, Hovhannisyan shared with Gebrekyan his adamant commitment to the modern movement, although far more adaptable to Iran in both his architecture and his diplomacy. He knew exactly how to speak to Iranian diplomats, to be able to build what he wanted, and therefore he had a very long and prolific career. With the 1935 letter by Hossein Allah, the then Iran's ambassador in London, he was offered a post in the technical department of the National Police, while at the same time submitting private and public commissions. Hovhannisyan's background has prepared him well for his very first project, very iconic project, very modernist project. This was the Girls' Art Academy, because he had paid his own education in Europe by teaching at the Armenian girls' schools. And so when it came to designing a school for girls' art academy, he knew exactly how to make it work. Here he implemented a structure that served the needs of art and women's education, where it was a modernist. So here you're seeing an architecture that has all the tenets of the modern movement. At the time, it would have really stood out in the context of the city. Not only was revolutionary in its language with these horizontal windows, this kind of curvilinear forms that are absent, rectangular form windows at the corner, balconies that open up in classrooms, really for 1935, a very revolutionary space, and would have looked as strange as women's education. And he opens his own firm. As you can see, he enlists women in his architectural firm, which was even unheard of in Europe. He follows Le Corbusier's idea of the 5 points of architecture. He comes up with his own 7 points of architecture, what real architecture is supposed to look like, which was again absent in the context of Iran, or just starting to begin to appear. And so he got a lot of different commissions, both from Reza Shah. For example, this is the Darband Hotel in sort of a north of the city in the mountains, which initiated and provided a language for the new tourist industry that Reza Shah was launching. And then he built buildings for a European company. So this is the Jeep headquarters in Tehran, again, with all of this new architectural language. Most prominently, he designed cinemas, which at the time had very deeply not just architectural implications, but also major social implications. Just imagine that unmarried boyfriends and girlfriends would spend 2 hours in a dark room sitting next to each other. And this was actually, modern cinemas were condemned by the more conservative strata of the society. But he designed a few of these. You see Cinema Diana here, Cinema Metropole, here, and a bunch of other cinemas he designed. So armed with the solid architectural education and often a long residency in Europe, Gevrakian and Hovhannisyan were followed by other young Iranian architects. So they're really chasing out the memoirs. And by the mid-30s, we don't see any building or any part of the city being designed by memoirs. Now, by the late 30s, all the buildings and the city itself is being recreated, refigured by architects, Iranian architects who have been trained in Europe and are coming back. So Mohammed Foroughi was one of them, Ali Sadegh was the other one, and Keyhosar Zafar. All of them returned by the end of the 30s and took part in a conflicting agenda: the establishment of a sovereign architectural profession and the rapid development of the nation. So it was sort of a two conflicting agendas. So as the protagonist of the modern middle class that was being formed, these architects often found themselves in a precarious position between a heavy-handed government and their own avant-garde spirit to practice without authoritarian interference. While relying on state patronage for prestigious projects, they tried to maintain an aloof attitude by developing architectural discourses that divorced their craft from political plots and royal intrigues. Like Siam and the Bauhaus, they insisted they had nothing to do with the world of politics. In the first edition of Architect, and you're seeing the cover of these, this is the first architectural journal, Moshiri declared that the Architect is purely a technological and aesthetic publication which cannot and does not wish to have slight involvement with the world of politics. So Hovhannisyan advocated the modern movement in Tehran by attacking the historicist Persian revival. So the works of the French and the British and the Germans were now being attacked by Iranian modernists. Again, in the Architect Journal, he asked, should one imitate the past or look towards the future for modern life? And he rejected revivalism, invalidating his contemporaries. So Godard's Archaeological Museum, Siro's National Library, Markov's Alborz College, and the post office, all of these he is attacking. He poked fun at the Persian revival facades that were very much part of the new Tehran downtown, and he said that lions and cows needed to stay in the zoo. So in post-war Tehran, the demand for young professionals in the field of architecture, engineering, and urban planning were immense in all sectors of the rapidly developing economy. The technical departments of the government ministries, the powerful national Iranian oil company, the Shah's plan and budget organization with its systematic 5-year plans, the numerous engineering and construction firms, the mammoth oil, gas, and petrochemical industries, and not to mention the various urban renewal and utopian schemes of the late Mohammad Reza Shah period. And here you're seeing these utopian ideas both in model forms and in poster forms, where you have a very modernist, white, clean, and pragmatic city. And you can notice in the very bottom of the poster on the left side is actually a woman with a very short skirt, a signifier of modernity. So many who played an important role in shaping modern architecture and urban planning during this period came, so we are talking about the 60s and 70s, from a cosmopolitan background themselves. Here, Hushang Seyhoun, the dean of the Faculty of Fine Arts and the architect of key national monuments, was a Baha'i. Marcos Grigorian and Anibal Al-Khas, pioneers of Iran's avant-garde art, were Armenian and Assyrian, respectively. Eugene Aftandilian, the architect of the era-defining Rudaki concert hall, was an Armenian. David Oshana, with a dozen modernist villas in northern Tehran, was an Assyrian. Rostom Voskanyan, the architect of the 10,000-seat Ararat Stadium, was an Armenian. And ending the century or the decade, Hossein Amonat, the representative Pahlavi professional who defined the modern and Iranian conundrum with his Shahiyat monument, was a Baha'i. And coming from the margins, too, were many more. There were women, number of very important women, including Nektar Papazian Andreev, the first female graduate of Tehran University School of Fine Arts in 1945. You can see her here actually explaining her project to the Shah. She was followed by Viktor Ohanjanyan and Emma Hakop Grigorian, Fauzieh Sadir, a Baha'i architect, and Veronique Saginian. I love this picture. She's actually sitting in Chicago in the temple of the modern movement facing Mies van der Rohe. So to be able to separate oneself from one's own community, small community, and through an official channel to be tossed into the international world of modernist architect was what these architects did. By removing one from one's local identity politics, these young architects partook in the modern movement's universal apolitics. So they stayed away from politics, but by that discourse, they actually were shaping a cosmopolitan city. A secular education at home had shaped their bilingual and worldly outlook towards the wider globe, which led to Europe. Once trained in the West, they returned to Tehran, where they found, so to speak, the best of both worlds: economic prosperity, supportive communities, rich social network, comfortable material lives, social mobility, and abundant source of income. In short, a pluralistic socio-urban ecosystem that they actually helped create. The conditions of modernity were social space of intervention and interaction that was in part their own doing. By the 1960s and throughout the 70s, Tehran had become a modernist cosmopolitan urban center that enabled a diverse group of professionals to emerge as an urban secular intelligentsia. The new organizational sensibilities had recalibrated the ethical and aesthetic values of this new elite. And so Tehran had grown from a small fortified city in the late 19th century to becoming one of the largest metropole in the world, as you can see in this sort of color-coded map. Yet in 1977, with a 4.5 million population, Tehran was revealed as a sharply divided capital city, ripe for a massive revolution that not only toppled the hegemony of the modern middle class, but also the institution of the Iranian monarchy. Le Corbusier's plea to provide good architecture to prevent a revolution had fallen on deaf ears.